So today I'm going to be talking about the anime Goblin Slayer, which I made a lot of reference to on the last anime that I reviewed, Free Run, the last video that I made. And I think it's a good point to do it right after because it's a nice contrast from the last anime that I reviewed. A lot of things that I mentioned that I liked or what I didn't like about the show, this one does a lot of the exact opposites, and it's still really good. So it goes to show that even two opposing genres or things that they do things that I don't necessarily like sometimes. A show can still be very good. This is one of my favorite animes of all time as well. Um, I've just been watching a lot of good shows lately, apparently. Goblin Slayer I watched sometime this year. I just got done yesterday watching that first two episodes for the new season, which I'll slightly talk about. Just keep in mind, spoiler alert, there might be a little bit of spoilers here. I'll try my best not to do that, but a little bit inevitable when you're doing an analysis or talking about a show to not have any spoilers, right? So just heads up on that. So I think Goblin Slayer is a great example of the anime that when people say that anime is for kids, or you get that meme like, oh, anime is for kids, or you shouldn't be watching that as an adult. I think it's a great example of why you shouldn't let your kids fucking watch anime. It's like, especially depending on what they're watching. Like, I don't know about that because I grew up watching like Dragon Ball and Naruto and other animes from like a very young age. And they probably weren't the best thing for me to be watching as a kid, but just because the gore and the violence. But I don't feel like I'm any less well adjusted because of that. And I think it actually taught me a lot of good lessons. So I don't know, just different style in parenting. But this is probably one that I would not show my kids, primarily because of the sexual themes I say and things like that. I think it's a little much, right? Nobody is saying anyone in Dragon Ball. So we will talk about that, which again, here's another. I don't know if the right what I should say, like a trigger warning or something like that. We will be discussing sensitive topics on this video, things that are violent and sexual nature. If this type of things disturb you, maybe this ain't the video for you. All right, so let's just start by giving some context, and for people who haven't watched the anime, just so they know what it's all about. Even though I have a suspicion that most people watching this video probably have already seen it, and if you haven't, I don't know that I would highly recommend. It really depends on what you're into and what you can stomach. Um, but different people are sensitive to different things. Hey, I couldn't watch Attack on Titan. Like I will admit that. Like I've seen every anime you can imagine. Not every anime, but I've seen animes my entire life and shows. I don't have a single problem with any topics. For some reason, Attack on Titan, as great as that show is, it was so disturbing for me. I don't even know how to explain exactly why, but that show is just too much for me. Made me anxious. Like, so hey, I'm not judging. If this show is not for you, maybe you should watch a review before you get into it. Because from episode one, you're already going to be traumatized if you don't know what you're getting into. And I'm sure most people who haven't even seen it, have seen TikToks or YouTube shorts of the first episode and the essay scene that happens, which we'll talk about because it was very controversial. A lot of people say it was unnecessary, and I have my opinions on it. But let's give a little context first. So, Goblin Slayer is a show about a young man who likes to slay goblins. Yeah, very generic like that. What's again cool is that they take a generic topic and they make it interesting with the character development, story development, and so on. Again, another show that has a very dull protagonist that is also the coolest motherfucker in the world. I really like the protagonist of the show as well. I think he's very well developed. So it's essentially it's like a D&D style kind of anime with real consequences and real tension that's brought here to the show, where a lot of things can kill you. This is not something where the characters are immortal. Nobody is Vegeta. Nobody can blow up a planet. Everybody, if they take a stab to the leg, they could die. Like it's very down to earth in that sense, and that helps keep the tension always very high. Because at any moment the characters can die, and they do get hurt quite often, and characters do die. So I think that's something that's brings the show down to earth a little bit and keeps things real and makes you care. I think a lot of shows, and I seem to use the same animes over and over as an example, and I'm sorry, it's because they're my favorite. There's shows like I love Naruto. Naruto is one of my favorite animes of all time, if not my favorite. But Naruto started losing me towards the end of the anime because the character started getting a little too overpowered. It seemed like nothing was really a challenge anymore. Everybody can blow up the world. Nobody dies. Everybody's immortal. Dragon Ball is a little like that too. But with Dragon Ball, it was kind of like that from the start, right? Since Dragon Ball Z, everybody was already extremely powerful, right? So maybe that was already set that way, but that also gets annoying really quick. So there are animes that lose me because the characters are just overpowered and there's no sense of difficulty or danger. Another one is like Yu-Gi-Oh! Love Yu-Gi-Oh! The original Yu-Gi-Oh! Show. But Yugi never loses. I think he loses once or twice, if that. But generally speaking, when it matters, the guy just never loses. So it loses its tension, right? It becomes a little less fun for that reason. I think this show does a great job of keeping it real in a sense. So this guy is essentially one of the adventurers of this guild of adventurers that take on quests to go do different things like kill goblins, kill trolls, kill dragons, kill demons, whatever, right? And our protagonist here, he's what's called a silver rank, which is a fairly high rank, it seems, on the limited scope of what the anime explains to us of how the ranking system there works. And he primarily and only takes contracts to kill goblins, which is seen as kind of like pathetic and stupid and kind of like a weirdo thing to do. He's considered kind of like a psychopath. No, he's not considered a psychopath. He is a psychopath, but he's more considered like a weirdo, right? Because instead of spending his time, people say like instead of spending your time doing this, you should be doing real hero work. You're at a level where you should be doing X or Y, and all this guy does is kill goblins, which is seen as something that beginners should do. The problem is what we're quickly exposed to is goblins can be very dangerous, and they just spawn, right? It explains to us how they're created, but they just spawn out of nowhere, and they devastate farms and villages and things like that. And because no, they don't pay. They're not contracts that pay very well. Actually, they pay pretty bad, is my understanding there. People don't tend to want to take these contracts, the heroes that have more experience, because they don't pay well. So you end up with a lot of new heroes and adventurers who take on these quests and then end up getting killed a lot because they underestimate the goblins. And just in general, people that don't take the contract because they don't pay. And so they cause a lot of devastation. And it's quickly explained to us that the reason why our psychopath protagonist here is so in love with killing goblins is because when he was very young, his family was in village was torn to pieces, devastated by these goblins, and it shows that his sister was, essayed by them, and God knows what else, right? And he watched all that, and it fucked him up, right? So I think that it does a good job of explaining to us early on why this guy is all about this. Why is this so important to him? Why he's so fixated on it to the point where he doesn't have his head all there, and can you blame him, right? So I think it does a good job of explaining that to us and showing us very graphically, and then we'll get into that why the graphic exposure of these scenes are so important. It's for us to really feel what he feels and really hate them as much as he hates them, because he has such a cartoonish, almost stupid and silly hatred toward these beings that it's almost like you would feel like it would get overused. But because the show develops so well how evil and atrocious the things these creatures do are, and what's happened to him and what's happened to his friends or whatever, people that he's seen, it really gives context, credence, and a reason as to why he is the way he is. And it doesn't justify him being a psychopath, but you kind of get it, right? He saw his sister get essayed and ripped apart by them among other people, and they seem to have a big fixation with women, those creatures, and doing things to them and just being evil in general. So you kind of get it. So early on in the story, without getting into too many spoilers, the show shows us that right off the bat. It doesn't start by showing us who the Goblin Slayer is. It doesn't start telling us who he is. It starts with a new party of heroes, and the main character technically, I think it's Goblin Slayer, but the second protagonist, which you could argue it's the main protagonist along with him, is this young little priestess. and she's going on her first mission, partnering up with this newer group of adventurers who unknowingly take a mission to go kill goblins. And like every initiate makes a mistake. They think it's going to be easy. They go underprepared and underexperienced and with the wrong gear. Um, and so they go in, and this is the first episode is really the one that is it's very shocking in nature. It's very graphic. It's very gruesome. It's a little it's disturbing. Especially if you're watching with someone. Like I was watching this with my wife, and she was like, "What the fuck? Can we watch something else?" I was like, "No, I kind of want to see where this is going." But yeah, I mean, I'm a particular person that, gosh, for you to introduce. I talked a little bit about this on my other review for another anime, Free Run, which doesn't have any sexual topics for the most part. If it does, it's very subtle. This has a lot of that, but it does it in a way where it actually helps give context, and not just context. It helps with the world building and character development. Sadly, but it does help the show with how it's exposed, and it does put you in a mood and in a feel where you get the protagonist. So it deals with a lot of sensitive topics, like I was saying, especially on the sexual part. This is a show that takes that to an extreme that most shows and animes and movies tend to stay away from, SA and things like that, right? Sexual violence and such. Which obviously there's sex and sexual topics, but they're more into themes of jokes and silly humor and things like that. Not so much on kind of what this show is going over. Even though it doesn't show a lot about that, the first scene is particularly shocking. The first season, so you'll know right off the bat if this show is for you or not, if you can stomach it, because it is disturbing. But this young party of heroes, they essentially go in to try to slay these goblins. And they're pretty much quickly surprised and ambushed, and they realize they're not up to par, and goblins are a lot harder to deal with than people seem to make them out to be. And they get completely slaughtered, and worse, right? The women get SA'd, and our little young priestess is almost about to die. And here's where I will mention a little bit about kind of like, it's a little out of left field for me to mention this. This show deals with a lot of sexual themes in a very mature, over the top, gruesome, almost to a fault way, but it also does have some sexual themes that I think are just silly, and not just silly. They're a little like borderlining on like kinky and like a little much, you know. For some reason, the protagonist tends to pee herself a lot, and that attracts the goblins to wanna go at her. But I almost feel like it. I don't know if out of place is the word. It's not out of place in this show, because this show right off the bat sets the stage for what it's about. So it's not out of place. But you can tell there's not really a purpose for that, other than, yes, when people are afraid, they pee themselves. It felt to me like it was an appeal to, gosh, I don't even think fan service is the word. I don't know how to explain, but they were clearly trying to appeal to some sort of kink or something, in my opinion, with that. A few different things here. And the show does appeal to a lot of different sexual themes, but I felt like that was a little bit out of place, but it's there. The girl tends to pee herself for whatever reason. But anyway, when she is about to get wrecked by these goblins, in comes the Goblin Slayer, who's our protagonist here, our hero, and saves her. And what's interesting about the Goblin Slayer is that for his rank, again, he only takes these missions that are related to slaying goblins. He wears armor that seems inappropriate for his rank, but it's exclusively appropriate for slaying goblins because of the mobility it provides. The same thing with his swords and shields. They're not big, great shields. They're not, huge bastard swords or, claymores or anything like that. He uses short swords because he shows us very early on that you can't swing a large sword inside of a cave, right? Which is normally where these goblins are. Shows us very quickly that everything that this guy does and wears is geared specifically towards this one task. And he saves our protagonist. She takes a liking to him. They start traveling together, yada yada, without spoiling, the show develops on. Now, again, this is a show that's entirely about and they adopt other party members very soon, which we'll talk about. But this is a show that adopts a theme very early on that could get overused very fast. Like, this is literally just about a guy that slays goblins. Well, what makes it so great? What makes it so engaging? Well, again, it's the scenery development, and it's not just the character development. It's the world development, right? You, along with the character, you develop a hatred for goblins, because again, because of what they do and how often the show shows how evil they are, and it doesn't just say that they're evil; it shows graphically what they do. So you really feel for the character, and you really want them dead along with him. So you're rooting for him a lot of times. I found myself really, really cheering him on, which is not normal for me in a show. I'm normally more just kind of passively watching it, or just going along for the ride. This one I really wanted him to win, because they set the stage so gruesomely. One of the scenes where he burns up a little bunch of goblin kids, and you're like, oh man, he's killing a bunch of infants. Even the other protagonist questions, like, they're just kids, why are you killing them? Well, it's because they grew up to be these assholes that do all these things and are just like a plague in the world. The way I started looking at him, kind of like how he seems to, it's kind of like how, Florida has a problem with snakes. Like, yes, we love animals, we don't want to kill animals, but it's getting out of control, and they're taking everything over, and they're a serious threat and a problem, right? Kind of like that, but to a little more of an extreme. They're just a plague that you have to get rid of them. It doesn't matter if they're young or if they're old. They just got to get rid of it. There's no emotion attached to it. They're just a pest that you got to get rid of, right? And again, this seems like something that could get very overused very quick. But the reason that it doesn't, number one, because it gives so much context. But number two, the action scenes are fantastic. Animation is great. The art is great. All that, like, fantastically done. But first of all, there is a real sense of tension. Again, because we see that right off the first episode, people actually die and have worse things than death happen to them as well in this show. So in our character, our main protagonist is not immortal. He does get hurt. He does pass out. He does bleed. He almost dies multiple times. Everybody almost dies multiple times, right? The girls get pretty close to getting essayed multiple times. So you're almost on the edge of your seat always. Even though, okay, well, he's done this like 100 times. Here we go in again to this cave to do the same thing. But it's always different. You're always tense, and it could always be the last time he goes in. And it's not as simple as just going in, because they ambush you. It develops very well on these different tactics of how to deal with them, right? Depending on how many there are, what levels of, what level they are, if there's trolls in there, ogres or whatever. Goblin priests or whatever they're called. I forget the name now, but there's different classes of these creatures, right, that have to be dealt in different ways. And this guy, all he does is study them and learn how to beat them. So he has various methods of how he does this. And it's almost like a hunting show. It's like how this guy goes about hunting these goblins. And trust me when I say it does not get overused just because they're so creative on the scenarios that come up and how he goes about it. Like, he doesn't just go in and swing at him. Like, everything he does, there's a plan. It's very methodical. He is a very meticulous person. It shows that every day before he leaves his home. He's like inspecting the place, checking for footprints, checking for broken grass and things like that, because he's worried about, his friend that he lives with, that she'll get hurt as well. And so it doesn't really get old. I will say that, and we'll talk about the second season, it is getting a little old. So, but I trust this studio to do a good job of continuing to innovate to where it will not get old. But I will say, I watched the first 2 episodes of the new season, and I was already like, this is getting a little, overused already. It might have been like a 1-season anime for me, but that's just my opinion. So why is the character interesting? So the character is interesting because, so he's a very dull guy that doesn't care about literally anything else other than killing goblins. And it's kind of comical in that sense. It's a little funny. People around him bring up different things, or what are you doing today? And his answer is always like, slaying goblins. Like, okay, well, whatever we do, as long as we get to slay some goblins, great. That's what I'm all about. That's what I want to do. He doesn't talk much. He's also he's not an asshole. Even though he knows a lot, he is very willing to let people do what they want. He's not like a dictator. He's not, for the type of character that he seems to be, he's not very high strung. He's not authoritative. He's very passive. He's very quiet. And he doesn't talk much, and he's not very confrontational either. He tends to go along with what people say, even though he's so experienced and knows so much. If someone tells him like, "Hey, I don't want you to burn goblins anymore. I don't want you to use fire," he's like, "Okay." "Oh, we should do this or that. What do you think?" "Okay." Like he doesn't argue too much, and I don't know why the character was developed in that way. I don't know why he is that way. It doesn't really explain, but he just is. To me, it just seems like almost like if I had a guess or kind of just give my take on why he is like that, it seems like someone that's dead inside. Like he almost seems like a tool of destruction that serves no other purpose other than to kill these creatures, to the point where he lacks opinions and he's almost lacks he's eroded his sense of self entirely. He doesn't have again an opinion on anything. He's not passionate about anything other than killing these goblins. And I don't even say wouldn't even say that that's a passion. It's more of like just an obsession. It's almost like he's stuck in a loop. Um, it's the way I would compare it. You know, the samurais used to say that if you live like a samurai, you're not good or evil. If you die in battle, you'll just reincarnate as a warrior again, and you're just gonna keep on this loop where you're over and over fighting and dying and fighting and dying, and that's just you're stuck on this loop. That's what it feels like for me for this character. It's almost like he's stuck on a loop, like he's clearly lost his mind, and to the point where he has no expressions for anything, no sense of emotion, sadness, anger, happiness for anything. He doesn't push back on people and their opinions. He doesn't have a lot of opinions of his own. He's just not a very fiery guy. It's like all this guy does is he's a shell of the person he once was as a kid, and now he almost seems stoned. Like he almost seems like he's always drunk and stoned. He's not. But if I had to describe it, it's like a drug addict that's always like numb and passively going through life, just going through the motions. He just seems like a character that's just going through the motions and is just stuck on this loop of killing these things because of the trauma that he experienced of watching his family, his sister, get brutally murdered, right? So because of that, it fucked up his brain, and now he's just this is what the man does, right? And because the show focuses so obsessively, not to be redundant, on his obsession, it's not old. You know what I mean? Because the show is all that's what it's all about, and it develops that so well. It's not boring. I think there is a shelf life for this show, in my humble opinion. I hope I don't upset anybody. You don't have to feel like I feel, but I do feel like this was a one season kind of show. Um, hey, I wanted the story to keep going just as much as the next guy, but I did feel like the second season is dragging out a little bit. Things are limited, items, spells, and things like that are limited. So it's not like skills and spells and potions can be spammed. Everything has a cost to it. Our hero, because he's always underpaid for the type of work he does, he doesn't have a lot of money, and he spends it all back on like fixing his gear and having gear to kill these goblins. And I could get into more of the specific scenes, but I won't spoil it. But again, everything has a sense of. I guess the best example I'll give is I love Skyrim and Fallout, right? I'm not a big fan of these games on their own. What I really like to do with these games, I love survival mode for these games. And the reason for that is because you end up exploring places you would never explore. You have to sleep, you have to eat. Every battle you go into, one or two shots you could die. You need water, you need food. That's what to me makes a game immersive. And I think that's what made this show very immersive for me as well. Is the same thing. Like they have rations, that could be a problem. They again, you get stabbed once, you could die. Nobody's immortal, and I think that because of that, again, it keeps the show grounded and it keeps things tense at all times. This is a very tense show that keeps you on the edge of your seat. These sexual themes on this show, for the most part, they are done in a very mature way, and not just mature. It's a little much type of deal. It's a little disturbing on how it's shown, but there is some fan service in there, which I think that it was out of place. It's not as dumb as sometimes some of these sexual themes are approached. Like I've mentioned this in another video that I made, the stupid boob anime humor that I always talk about the nosebleed and all that. There's none of that, but there is, like especially with his friend there, the redheaded girl. Like there's obvious sexualization of characters and things that are shown just for the sake of fan service. it is done in a fairly mature way. There's no humor involved with the sexualization of the characters. Like, it's not funny that some girl has big boobs or whatever. It doesn't present it that way. She just does. It's not funny that the one of the protagonists always pees herself, but she does. So at least it's done in a way where it's not silly, but it's definitely kind of banking on it is not the right word. It's definitely taking advantage of that a little bit, and I did not like that. If you're gonna make something so serious as constantly talking about SA, okay, where these creatures violate women and do all this stuff, which is shown very graphically and it's very disturbing, I don't think that then we should add fan service in there, because not only does it take away from the seriousness of it, the way it's presented, like if this is not a straight up like a hentai about goblins that are violating, anime girls, if that's not the theme of the show, the way it was presented, it's very serious and mature and sad. For you to then introduce these other sexual themes in there and very fan servicey, I almost feel like it's not even necessarily out of place is not the right word. It's almost it's disrespectful, and not even disrespectful. I think it's tasteless. It's a little gross, Like if that's gonna be the theme where we're gonna be dealing on very serious, horrific, immature topics, that's fine. It goes perfectly along with the vibe of the show. But then if you're gonna turn around and constantly make light and not in a joking way, but constantly like show, okay, it's constantly showing like his best friends how she has big tits and how it's constantly zooming in on them and showing them bouncing and all that, like, and in a non-joking way. If we're gonna do that, which is takes away from the seriousness of it, I don't think we should have as serious sexual themes the way they were introduced before. Because again, it almost like it's not devalues is not the right word. It almost undermines the right word. It undermines sexual violence. I think this show does that to a degree. It undermines sexual violence. But again, another example of a show that doesn't need fan service. There's plenty of sexualization. There's plenty of these type of scenes where it was very serious, very well introduced, even if disturbing. It made sense for the context of things. But for you to throw like kinky things on top, like the girl peeing herself, and all these different fan service moments, I think that it's honestly, I was not a fan of that, simply for the fact that I think that it disrespected the seriousness of some of the topics that were being discussed through the entirety of the show. So that was not a thing that I was a fan of. But aside from that, if you turn off your brain on that aspect and you don't think about it too much, it's pretty unapologetic. I think that's the other thing too. Like obviously the creators didn't care that was going to be a problem. They clearly did not care if the show was going to be disturbing or not. They clearly don't care about my opinion, and that's fine. But I'm still allowed to give my opinion on what I think. But I think that that's in a way what makes the show good as well. They're not trying to censor the show for you or for it to be more palatable to the masses. They are going to show you as graphic as they can the show that they want to show, and you just deal with it or don't watch it type of thing. And I do think that shows are at their best when they are presented in that way. So that is something to say for it. You will find criticisms on everything that you look for, but I do still think that even if some things are disgusting or out of place or undermine certain serious topics, I do still think that artists are at their best when they're not being censored. I do think that artists need to be given the ability to creatively express themselves without restriction. And when they are placed in those environments is when the best work that anybody can put out comes. And I think this is a good example of it. They clearly didn't censor themselves. They clearly didn't sanitize the show for anyone. They just made what they wanted to make unapologetically. And I think that that's why the show is very good, even though it has its flaws. Again, I think that the whole genre and theme of the guy that's just obsessed with killing goblins, it's a little overused at this point. I don't think the show needed a second season, frankly, even though it was great. I think it's I'm not liking the second season so far, and it's not because it's bad. It's just more of the same, right? And I think there's a shelf life for something like this. But with that said, for that first season, I think there's enough episodes to where you're like, it's enough, not too many, not too few. You do understand what the character is doing. Fight scenes are amazing. Tension is great. Everything in the show is presented very well. So I would highly recommend this show to everybody who is into a little more action, gory type animes, and you're looking for more of an anime that is a little more violent than something calmer. But do be warned. I think I've said it plenty. It does deal in pretty sensitive and disturbing topics, and it doesn't always present them on the best way.